Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches, Jekyll and Hyde. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the character of Mr. Utterson, how he's presented and why he is important. If you've not finished reading the novella, do be warned, this video will be full of spoilers. For now, let's get started. Okay, let's just start looking at the way that Artisan is introduced to us at the very beginning of chapter 1. So I've got some nice quotes for you and just a few little critical terms to help you out along your way with your flashcards. So Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, long, lean, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. Okay, so what we've got here, we've got this big long listing of kind of his qualities, and at first he's actually made to sound quite dull, quite deliberately dull. We've got this metaphor that says that his rugged countenance was never lighted by a smile, so quite sort of grumpy looking. He's cold, he's scanty, he's embarrassed, so he's socially awkward. And then we've got this list of adjectives, so asyndetic listing just until the end. So lean, long, dusty, dreary. So again, suggesting that he is like old, but then we get the juxtaposition. Yet somehow lovable. Now this is really important because it is the first moment where we start to kind of connect with the ideas of duality, that man is not just one thing. Now it's not in the same way as Jekyll where he's kind of polar, but it still shows that Artisan is a man of contrast. We learn in the opening chapter about how Artisan does not like to judge fellow man, or if he does judge, he still would rather help someone. You know, he would always help rather than sort of tell them off. And for that reason, we've got, this is one of my favourite quotes of Artisan. It was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. So we've got this sort of euphemism here, down-going men. He basically means men that have fallen, or like, you know, fallen sort of from grace, that who's perhaps have started behaving badly, or maybe fallen into crime or immorality. Yet he is always the last. Check out the repetition of this adjective here. The last reputable acquaintance. Now, reputable means of good reputation, and again, we've got good influence. So we're being, it's being pointed out to us how good Artisan is, but not only is he good, he will always stand by his friends. He will always do anything he can to help them. So this is of course foreshadowing, because Jekyll is going to be one of these down-going men, and what we will learn is that Utterson will stand by him until the very, very end. So this is great foreshadowing. And then we get a description of him as a friend, which is important for the same reason. And it's, again, this use of simile that is telling us that his affections, like ivy, with the growth of time. So yes, it takes time to build up friendship, but then they are absolutely strong. So this is really, really important information to get at the beginning of the story, because it prepares us for that part of his character that is always going to be there and is always going to look out for Jekyll. We also learn about the fact that he is a lawyer, so there is an idea about the kind of his sort of sense of rationality and reason here, and we get very much the impression that he is a true Victorian gentleman, the epitome of a Victorian gentleman. So certainly quite restrained, reserved, cares very much about reputation, doing the right thing. But this only little quirk to his character is that he would not reject a person whose moral compass had gone askew. Now, one of the best things about Utterson is the way that his character develops, because at the very start of the novel, when he and Enfield are talking, they're talking about the story of the door, of course. Enfield says that the more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask, meaning Enfield says, if anything looks a bit peculiar, I just keep out of it. I, you know, mind my own business. And most importantly, the lawyer, Utterson, agrees, a very good rule too. So it sets up a kind of standard for how Utterson normally behaves. I don't look into other people's business. I don't get involved. I don't judge. And then, of course, he realizes Hyde's influence on Jekyll, mainly because the story of Enfield, and then rereading the will and getting himself into quite a tiz. And there is a massive shift. Look at these 3 quotes again. Any of these will do to prove this point about growing obsession with Hyde and how he kind of goes back on what he originally said. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. So repetition of toiling, like working. He's got busy head, and he is besieged by questions. Lovely kind of war metaphor there, suggesting violence. So he can't control the questions in his head. Again, it's a sign of his friendship. It's a sign of his goodness. We get this beautiful metaphor here that his imagination was engaged, or rather enslaved. Again, that metaphor emphasizing the strength, the intensity of his desire to help Jekyll and protect him. And then everyone's favorite line when he decides that he's going to find Mr. Hyde for himself. If he be Mr. Hyde, he thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. Lovely pun there on hide and seek, the game. But all of this is demonstrating to us how good a friend Utterson is, but it also shows the sort of, it emphasizes how strange and difficult Jekyll's situation is for him to change his ways so dramatically. Another thing that is really important to consider when thinking about Utterson is the fact that we as the reader understand what's going on because of his perspective. We read it through his eyes. Now, here is a term for you that will be really useful for your essays, because we read it through his eyes, but it's not written in first person, not the bulk of the story. I know the letters later on are from other characters. But those first 8 chapters are written in what we call third person limited narration, i.e. it's still third person. Okay, you can see that through the way that, you know, you're seeing third person pronouns, you've got Artisan, you've got the clerk and all the rest of it. But it is very much from the stance, from the perspective of one character, and that character is Utterson. So that is how we end up reading it through his eyes. Now, this is really, really clever, because it means that we misunderstand the story along with Utterson, and Stevenson is able to kind of chuck us some red herrings to create misdirection in the story to kind of keep us hooked. It's only once you get to the final chapter that you read back and realise, just as Utterson would have. So I've given you this as an example. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of that to you because that would take too long. But this is a moment where he's gone to get some advice from his clerk, Mr. Guest, and Mr. Guest happens to see a note from Jekyll alongside the letter that Utterson has asked him to look at, and you know, reveals that the handwriting is the same, albeit slightly different because of the slant. And this is the red herring that we get because we're reading it through Utterson's eyes. No sooner was Mr. Utterson alone that night that he locked the note into his safe, where it reposed from that time forward. What, he thought, Henry Jekyll forged for a murderer? And his blood ran cold in his veins. So we experience Utterson's shock along with him, because the sensible, rational, reasonable interpretation of this strange behaviour is that Henry Jekyll has forged this note to try and get Hyde out of trouble. And, you know, the reader going along with Utterson will believe that with him. So it's a really good misdirection. And on that note, it's important to actually think about Utterson's role of rationality and reason, because, you know, it's a really interesting book because you've got this blend between the kind of Gothic supernatural and the detective genre, and he is obviously playing the role of the detective. And so him as a Victorian gentleman, there's just no way that he's going to consider supernatural causes, which makes it more of a shock when it is finally revealed. So all the way through, he is using logic and reason to work his way out of the predicament or the problem in his mind. So right early on, Search for Mr. Hyde, he uses logic and reason, and he says, this lovely metaphor, that it must be the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, i.e. he's like, right, Mr. Hyde must come from Jekyll's past because he had a wild past, and he's being blackmailed. So logical, reasonable. And then likewise in The Last Night, when Poole gives him all of these mad, you know, accounts of the person's behaviour behind the door. Look at what Utterson reasons. He decides that he is seized with one of those maladies, illnesses, that both torture and deform the sufferer. And that's the explanation for the alteration of his voice, wearing a mask, avoiding his friends, his desire to find the drug. And he actually says, right, that's it. I've figured it out. He's got an illness. Kind of illness. The only way that Utterson can even begin to conceive of the sort of dark supernatural roots of the mystery is through his dreams. And so this is also chapter 2, Search for Mr. Hyde, where he dreams of Mr. Hyde as an almost supernatural figure. If at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly and still the more swiftly. So this idea of Hyde being like a gliding monster that is able to be anywhere at any point. Just a few little notes to help you on your way with Utterson if he comes up as a character question. But obviously, by revising Utterson, you're also revising other themes as well. Give me a shout if you've got any more questions. Just pop them in the comments and I will get back to you. Otherwise, do stay tuned, subscribe if you haven't, and then you'll see more videos coming your way on themes and characters of Jekyll and Hyde, plus much more. Thanks again. Happy revising.